Much of an introduction here. We're going to have, for the Ed segment today, a presentation by Comrade Dave Lampe. This is, my understanding, a condensed version of a presentation he gave a couple months back on the crossroads we're at in terms of the climate, and I don't really have too much else to say, so I'll just let Dave have at it.
Okay, thank you. My name is Dave Lampe. I use he, him pronouns. What I'm going to do today, actually talking with Justin Pearl, basically wanted me to kind of give you a little summary of the politics of climate change right now. And so that's what I'm going to do. So I just want to remind people sort of I'm not going to talk too much about the science of climate change. I think everybody on this call probably understands that climate change is real. We are basically, if you take a look at this figure, the humans have pushed the Earth into a sort of a space where we have some decisions to make. We can either continue to emit CO2 by burning fossil fuels and heat the planet up to a point where it's unstable and becomes what we call a hothouse Earth, or we make some decisions now to move us to what this figure calls a stabilized Earth, which is warmer than it used to be, but not completely out of control. And I think that one of the things I want to just emphasize is the fact that these decisions are time sensitive. We can't just continue to talk about it. We have to take action. So the politics of climate change, where are we at? I guess I have two messages. There's bad news, but there's increasingly good news too. At every level. So I'm going to briefly talk about what's going on internationally, nationally, at the state, and then I'll finish up with the local level. So in terms of international efforts, there have been multiple international efforts to tackle climate change. The most recent one happened in 2015. This is the so-called Paris Agreement, where pretty much every country on Earth met in Paris and decided that it would be a good idea to hold the increase in global average temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, but it would really be a much better idea to hold it below 1.5 degrees. That was agreed to in 2015 by 196 nations. There's no enforcement mechanism whatsoever, but the US did agree to this. That was 5 years ago. What it means to hold ourselves to those temperatures is we need to make a 40 to 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. That's just 10 years from now. And we need to be in a completely carbon neutral world by 2050. As I pointed out, the US joined that agreement under Obama. And then, of course, we left it, the only country to leave it under Trump, but we'll probably rejoin it when Biden becomes president. We have actually reduced carbon emissions, but only due to COVID. When people measure these things, it seems that at least globally, we've reduced emissions by about 7% this year, completely by accident and in an uncontrolled way. But we have to do that same level of emission reductions every year for the foreseeable future, but in a more controlled way. The track record for these international agreements is not good. So what I'm showing you here is the famous Keeling Curve. These are actual measurements of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere over time. And superimposed on that are the dates of various different international agreements that have been agreed to over the years. And I think it's easy to see that there's been no effect at all on carbon emissions. So here's the Paris Agreement from 5 years ago. We need to start bending this curve to the point where at least it stabilizes and then eventually in the future can be reduced. A lot of the reasons that these agreements have failed is the complete failure of the United States to show any meaningful leadership on this. We agree to these things and then we don't actually do anything. So what are the odds of something happening now? Well, Trump is gone, okay? Biden made some promises during his campaign about the climate, which is, as far as I know, the first time that that's ever happened at the presidential level. So there's some good news there. He promised to make action on climate change a central part of his administration. And if you read his campaign literature and his transition literature, he shoots for basically what the Paris Agreement says we need to do, an economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2050. by a variety of means. And if you read the details, some of those I think are probably not realistic, but at least there's promises there. A big one is carbon-free electricity production by 2035. And the nice thing about that goal, at least, is that wind and solar are getting super cheap and getting cheaper. Right now, I think that they are the cheapest form of electricity production, cheaper than fossil fuel production. And even the capitalists know this. You're seeing a lot of banks that bankroll fossil fuels start to pull out of funding future projects and starting to bankroll wind and solar. Biden is starting to make some cabinet picks that are related to climate. Some of them seem okay. I'm kind of holding back judgment on some of these things. He nominated Obama's old second-term EPA administrator, Gina McCarthy, as his White House climate advisor. He nominated Jennifer Granholm for energy secretary. She's the former governor of Michigan. Importantly, Biden did not nominate this guy, Ernesto Moniz, who is a big fan of natural gas. So he's not coming. Good for him. And he nominated Deb Haaland for Interior Secretary. She's a first-term congresswoman from the state of New Mexico and a Native American. Other cabinet nominations, I would just pass a meh on some of these. John Kerry for International Climate Rep. He's Obama's International Climate Rep. I'm not a giant fan of his. And then this is the weirdest one, Pete Buttigieg for Transportation Secretary. I think that this is not a serious appointment. This is a kind of a miscongeniality for dropping out of the race right before the South Carolina primary. Okay, so there's some good news here, but there's also some bad news. And the biggest bit of bad news is that Biden comes out of the Obama administration. And the Obama administration was terrible for the climate. As much as Barack Obama wants to pretend that he was good for the climate, he's not. His energy policy was all of the above. It was under his presidency that fracking took off in a big way, including in Pennsylvania. And you could just look at graphs that show this. I mean, this is oil production in the United States. Here's when Obama takes office, and it's easy to see that his all of the above energy policy just drove fossil fuel production in the United States to all-time highs. Biden made it a big point, to emphasize he would not ban fracking. Said that in the debate several times, but he did promise to ban it on federal land. That would have no effect at all in Pennsylvania. It would have effects out west, especially in New Mexico. Okay, so that's sort of the national scene. Let's talk about the state of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a fossil fuel, big fossil fuel state. We're still the third largest coal producer in the United States after Wyoming and West Virginia. We're the second largest methane producer after Texas. There is a little bit of good news in this state, although I would say not much. The governor wants to join something called the RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. What this is a regional effort, mostly of northeastern states and Virginia, to cap and trade fossil fuel emissions. And in those states where it's been put into effect, you have seen CO2 emissions go down. I don't know if Wolf can do this by himself. I think it needs to pass the legislature, and of course that's a Republican-dominated legislature. But anyway, there's a push on for us to join that. The bad news, there's plenty of it in Pennsylvania. Wolf supports subsidies for businesses using fracked gas and fossil fuel liquids. And he signed a bill, House Bill 732, in July that had large bipartisan support, which gives subsidies for companies to come in and use especially the fossil fuel liquids to make plastic and fertilizer. Most recently, he has supported a proposal to put a liquefied natural gas facility in the eastern part of the state. That happened a week or two ago. Both of these things are popular, both among Republicans and Democrats in the legislature. As far as the liquefied natural gas facility, this is the eastern part of the state. This is Scranton right here. There's a plant that's going to be built to liquefy fracked natural gas and ship it by truck, hundreds of trucks down this blue route um, across the Delaware River into New Jersey, or by rail by this red route here um, to a terminal that'll be across the Delaware River from Philadelphia, where it'll be loaded onto ships that look like this and probably sail to Europe. That's probably the most likely place where this stuff would go. And as I said, that was just approved, I think last week or the week before. But there is some good news on liquefied natural gas, and it's due to capitalism. This project might actually die due to capitalism and a lot of activism in Europe. There are reports now for people that analyze this sector that the demand for American liquefied natural gas could be it could be a 77% drop in that demand, mostly due to the fact that the European countries are beginning to take climate change seriously, and they don't like American fracked gas. And this is due in large part to a lot of activism in many different countries. This is a picture from Ireland, but also in Germany and in France. So the demand just might not be there, and this project might never happen. In Western Pennsylvania, there's abundant bad news. The cracker plant, this is a petrochemical plant being built across from Beaver, is nearly done. And that thing, when it fires up, will begin to make plastic and emit as much CO2 every year as 500,000 cars. The county executive, Rich Fitzgerald, just loves fracking. He can't do enough to support it. And he also is a big fan of dirty air. As you probably know, Allegheny County has some of the worst air quality in the country. Another bit of bad news, and this is something that maybe we want to talk about after I'm done, is there is strong union support for fossil fuel projects. There's thousands of jobs are tied to these projects. They're big, they're multi-year, they pay good wages. I remember a little more than a year ago sitting in a kind of an environmental / union meeting where the business manager of the operating engineers basically flatly stated that a third of their billing hours come from these fossil fuel projects. So that's a problem. There is huge bipartisan support for these things, in part because of the cover that the unions give them to support them. And so I just point to this House Bill 732 that was passed this past summer. But there is a bit of good news, okay? And I'll include Ohio and West Virginia in this as well. There had been planned as many as 5 cracker plants up and down the Ohio River Valley. All of the new ones that I am aware of are either on hold or might be completely dead, partly due to the economic impacts of COVID. And in part due to a big global backlash against plastics, it's pretty clear that we cannot continue to make and dispose of plastics the way we are, because they end up in landfills and they end up in the water supply, and this just can't continue. So there's a big backlash against plastics, exactly the stuff that's going to be made at these so-called factories. At least one big ethane storage project in Ohio was canceled. The fracking pad that was planned at the U.S. Steel site in Braddock was canceled, more due to ineptitude, I think, than anything else, but that seems to be dead. There are a lot of bankruptcies that are happening now among the frackers. They've burned through a lot of money. Their product is not very profitable. The biggest fossil fuel methane producer, at least historically, was Chesapeake Energy, and they're bankrupt. So there's a lot of consolidation in this industry going on right now. The Attorney General over the summer filed criminal charges against a bunch of frackers for environmental crimes, but most of those had pretty low fines attached to them, so I'm not certain how serious that was, but I know that there are other charges that are coming as well. The good news in Western Pennsylvania, I think, is that Peduto participated in and released in the last month something called the Marshall Plan for Middle America. This is a plan that was laid out by policy people, mostly based at the University of Pittsburgh. But if you read it, it seems to be an effort to kind of get ahead of Green New Deal efforts at the national level and steer them towards the Ohio River Valley. It calls for $60 billion a year for 10 years for the entire region. to support green energy projects. This is made up of both public and private money. And if you look at the details, the private money seems to be an attempt to steer pension fund money to these projects. The idea is to make the region carbon neutral by 2050, both by changes in energy production and energy efficiencies, and to cut CO2 emissions 50% by 2030. And believe it or not, amazingly, which you don't tend to see in these documents, there is an emphasis on a just transition from the old fossil fuel economy to a green economy, both in transitioning the workers from that economy, but also for the regions that have been historically impacted by this. So that actually was a fairly large part of this plan. So in summary, we're at a crucial point for the climate. We need to have immediate, large-scale, meaningful action to avert basically catastrophic changes. The political situation is mixed. Trump is gone. He was terrible for the climate, but the Democrats historically have been bad too. And they're doing the bare minimum, I think, and will need to be pushed constantly at every level from the national down to the local level. A key thing that needs to happen, and I think DSA can help in this, is to disengage union support from fossil fuel building projects. That has to be a goal. On the other hand, these people need other things to build. And I think that they're going to be a key to building the green economy, but they need to be convinced to quit supporting the fossil fuel projects that they are participating in now. I think there's also a danger and an opportunity in this transition as we move to a green economy. We want a green future, but I don't think, obviously, we want to reproduce capitalist control over it. I think a good thing about some of this technology is that it's very amenable to decentralized control, especially solar. If you think about it, I think we're at a Gramscian moment, really. The old is dying and the new cannot be born. But the new has to be born, and it better hurry up if we're going to avoid a climate catastrophe. And I'll just leave you with this. This is I'm the outreach director for the local chapter of Extinction Rebellion. We're a direct action climate group. There hasn't been a lot of direct action with COVID, but that will eventually go away. So if you're interested in this sort of a thing, here are the contact information. And I'm happy to take any questions.
I'll do a stack just because I was looking at that. So William Murray and let's see, Jacob, and then okay. So William, you're up.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you for the presentation. Climate change is near and dear to all of our hearts, but mine more so, especially. Do we have a stance on nuclear energy? I don't believe that was discussed whatsoever. I noticed that the Beaver Valley plant was in danger of closing, and it only just got saved, I think, because of Tom Wolf's climate plan, is what I saw in the news. But 3 Mile Island, the second unit, also got shut down last year. So, I mean, that creates opportunities for when those close to, I don't want to run over my time, but when those plants close, it creates opportunities for natural gas to step in. And I'm wondering if new nuclear is something that we're all looking at, interested in, on the fence about, just curious.
I mean, if you say we, nuclear is carbon free, but it's got its own huge set of problems. It's expensive. It needs giant subsidies. It's extremely dirty. There's nothing to do with the waste. So I think that, in most of the climate plans that I have seen, nuclear is not something that is emphasized. New nuclear, I should say, is not emphasized simply because of the cost.
Okay, then I think Jacob was on stack, and Shay, L, and Zach Michaels.
Yeah, Dave, I appreciate the presentation and everything, and it is a really solid overview, particularly the state level stuff that I wasn't sure about. But I'm just really curious why we're giving credit to the very, very, very liberal New American Marshall Plan, which is Caduto's month-long word salad attempt to not endorse the Green New Deal and just like drag socialists to hell and back. He's a stated class and ideological enemy who isn't interested in the things that we're talking about, and his local party is funded fully by fracking money. So I just, I'm very confused to see that given any kind of credit in this presentation. I'm curious if you could add some more context to that.
Sure. So I was skeptical when it was announced as well. I took the time to read the entire thing. It is, I think, Peduto's attempt, Peduto and the other mayors that participated in this. So there's a variety of cities that are participating in this up and down the Ohio River Valley. It looks like an attempt to not repeat the mistakes of the past where, you're seeing an industry going away. They know the fossil fuel industry is going away. And it's an attempt to not have happen what happened with the steel industry. It's an attempt, I think, to at least manage a replacement. How that happens and whether it's under, we return to capitalist control of the new energy economy, I certainly doubt that he would want a socialist control of that. But, I do think it's a serious attempt to try to manage the transition. I want to give him some credit for that, right? We can oppose him on many levels, and we can also, at least recognize that, as I say, even the capitalists understand that we are going to have this change. I mean, my and Extinction Rebellion's biggest beef is that this is not going to happen nearly fast enough. We have a limited amount of time to do this. So it's a mixed message. I don't want to say that I'm not a giant Bill Peduto fan, but I do give him some credit for at least recognizing that fossil fuels are not the future.
Okay. Shay.
Hi. You had made a distinction with Europe that they weren't interested in American gas. Is Europe turning away from fracking in general, or are they just more interested in doing it on their continent and don't want to do the international trade of it?
So the only place I know of that fracking is taking place in Europe is in Great Britain. And there's huge opposition to it. When I say they're opposed to American natural gas, the Trump administration in particular has been pushing Europe to accept American fracked liquefied gas, mostly to undermine Russia. The natural gas that is burned in for heating and industrial purposes mostly comes from big pipelines in Russia. And this is mostly just a geopolitical issue. The Europeans recognize the environmental cost of frack gas, and they're perfectly content, frankly, to take Russian gas as long as the Americans stay out of their way. So I think that it's a complicated question. They don't frack that much in Europe. They don't want our fracked gas, but they're content to use Russian methane if the Americans weren't pressuring them.
L and Zach Michaels and Matt Rubin.
So my question's kind of along the lines of Jacob's question, and I was wondering what you think exactly Bill Peduto doesn't like about the Green New Deal. Like, is it a matter of not enough money coming to the area? And, with respect to, not wanting the same thing to happen with fracking that did with the steel industry, like I don't feel like there's really, and, like speaking about Peduto's perception of this or whatever, I don't think there's really any comparison to be drawn between like fracking and steel, like just in terms of the sheer size of the industries. So why is the Green New Deal not good enough for him?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that the perception that I get is that the Democratic Party in Allegheny County is mostly pretty united behind fossil fuels. Peduto has been the only person that I have seen to even mention that might not be a good thing. This happened about a year ago at a climate conference where he publicly stated that he didn't want to see any more petrochemical plants coming in, And immediately the next day, Fitzgerald shat all over him. Okay, so I think that the political situation in Western Pennsylvania is in flux. I think that there is, and I don't think this stuff is basically stated and out in the open. I think that, they have to basically support fossil fuels infrastructure, partly because of all the union jobs tied to it. But I do think that behind the scenes, there is an underlying recognition that this is going to go away. And I think that this is, at least this is my reading of it, trying to get out ahead and perhaps plan for a green transition in this region. I mean, I don't know all the details. They're not going to discuss this with me.
Hey, Zach Michaels and then Matt, and I don't know if people want to close stack there.
I just want to add that Chris George has been on stack for a minute.
Oh, sorry. It must have gone. I'm sorry, Chris. I think Chris, then Zach, then Matt.
I think Zach M's before me.
Okay.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that, you're part of a direct action thing that hasn't been able to do direct action because of COVID. I was just kind of wondering, how has COVID affected like the trajectory overall? Has it like given any kind of time buffer because like people aren't, driving out as much, or has it made everything worse because people like need, more fuel or whatnot to meet their daily needs? This crisis, like, I don't know, how has COVID changed the calculus, if it has at all?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Just in terms of like moving forward on changing energy, has this like completely new paradigm that we've been in for a year, has that changed the calculus? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some things that have happened in terms of, I mean, for the, everybody working from home in many cases is, certainly the demand for transportation fuel is down. I think the capitalists see that as an opening though for themselves. I mean, most of you are probably working from home. The demands on your time are probably increasing because now there's no separation between work and home. My son is going through this. He works a lot. Doesn't commute to work anymore, but the work is still as much as it was, or maybe more before. In terms of direct action, how has COVID destroyed that? I mean, there have been protests, obviously, the Black Lives Matter protests and things like that. But in terms of climate protests, the big action that was going to be planned was going to be the 50th anniversary of Earth Day last April, and that just completely got derailed. And for many groups, that was something that has been hard to recover from. But anyway, I think it's going to take direct action to push this as rapidly as it needs to go. But again, it's hard to do in a viral pandemic.
Dave, I was wondering if you, or if anyone else has ideas, you could put it in the chat, have any thought about, there's kind of this debate about the concept of degrowth and basically having less than even a steady state economy in terms of, like, in the developed world, our overall economic production versus kind of a more futurist, using new technologies to try and reduce carbon through like qualitative easing and high-tech stuff to like make big projects to try and plant a gazillion trees and so on. I'm just curious your thoughts on like, do we actually have to try and make a smaller economy? And if so, how do you talk to people about that? Or is there ways to use technology, if it wasn't for capitalism, to reduce our carbon footprint more quickly?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that when you do the thought experiment about where we should probably go in terms of, if you prioritize the climate, then yeah, the degrowth and things like that are attractive. The problem is degrowth does not make sense in a capitalist economy. You can't degrow a capitalist economy. So I think that you're going to see a whole lot of struggle over this. You're going to see people claiming, to try to make progress for the climate, but in fact, they're going to be reproducing a capitalist economy that attempts to be green, and there's a whole lot of greenwashing that goes on with that. I mean, amazingly, Range Resources, which is probably one of the biggest frackers around here, is touting itself as going carbon neutral in its production. I mean, what they mean by that is, the drilling of the hole and the hauling away of all the, the stuff. But it's absurd. But that's the kind of thing that you see around this. So I don't know. I don't know what kind of answer that is for you, but that's it.
Thank you.
Okay, Matt, Ruben, then me, and I think we'll close stack just because we don't want to go over time.
Cool. So before I get to my question, a thing Chris just said made me think about a thing I just want to share with everybody, which is that futurist vision. I think it's worth making sure everyone knows that Uber has announced to investors that they have concluded their future of self-driving cars is not possible. They're giving up on it. So just give a fuck Uber in the chat. I mean, basically what that means though is that their only paths to profitability are they're just hemorrhaging money, and they're just basically taking tons of investor dollars to either destroy taxis and then raise their prices to be profitable, or to automate their cars to then not have labor to be profitable. And so they're just gonna, I guess they're gonna go for a monopoly or something. But fuck Uber. But the question I have is just Dave, I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about do we have reason to actually be hopeful about Biden's climate picks? I know Sunrise Movement has been I've seen them being cautiously hopeful, and I also I respect their work, and also I know it's really hard to balance sort of an inside outside strategy, and I think sometimes I've seen them being a little bit too kind to Biden, it seems like, but it's it can be hard to walk that line. I'm also glad that our nationalist eco-socialist strategy is to be on the outside and push for the right thing, but it's also it's helpful that there are some people who are pushing on the inside. I'm interested in hearing people talk more about are they being too kind? Are these people good? Why should I be excited that Biden picked Obama's climate advisor as his climate advisor? Why is that better than Obama's climate advising? Because we just said that sucked. So why is it good now?
I completely agree. I mean, the reason that I put in the bad part is the fact that a lot of these are Obama retreads, and Obama was terrible for the climate. So I on the one hand, we are all right to be extremely skeptical of Biden. He is an Obama retread. On the other hand, I do think that there is a recognition that business as usual cannot continue. Personally, I think that things will certainly get better than they were under Trump, but I also feel that it will not be nearly enough to make a dent in fossil fuel emissions, the kind of dent that science tells us that we need. I mean, how much of this is just optics and how much of it is going to be real change? I in my heart of hearts, I feel like it's more optics than anything else. But this is where I think working on the outside and constant pressure at every level is going to be necessary. I think we have an opportunity in Pittsburgh. Honestly, I think there are cracks within the ruling class. I mean, I think you see it. You see Peduto wanting to be, I think, recognized as a climate leader. You have other opposing forces, and when the capitalists and the ruling class are fighting amongst themselves, that's a good thing, okay? And we can maybe help push it and kick them when they're down. I think there's an opportunity. I'm trying not to be completely pessimistic, but past actions sort of predict what's going to happen.
Okay, I guess I'll be the last person. My thing was more of a comment because I was thinking, because I remember earlier this year, show you how long this year's been, oil prices, I remember when COVID started, just completely collapsed at that point, and that makes me think that's what's happening with fracking lately. Would that be the correlation why fracking also kind of collapsed at the same time and so many companies went bankrupt because they didn't think oil prices would go down to like negative? I guess that's more of a comment than a question.
I mean, I think one of the things that you see among the frackers is this desperation to make pipelines, right? They cannot sell their product in North America for a profit. They've got to export it. And I think a place of pressure is to oppose every single new pipeline and every single new export facility for this. And you know,
Yeah.
capitalism will drive them to extinction itself.
Yeah.
But we have to keep them from being able to sell this stuff for a profit. They can't do it now. This is an industry that has burned through nearly $1/3 of $1 trillion and has never made a profit. I'm amazed that it's still going, but you know, I don't understand capitalism that well, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you can close it up, Zach.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for the presentation and for your answers to the questions and just general comments. I definitely agree that trying to stop the flow of capital at any chance we can get it's obviously a big undertaking, but it seems to be what you have to do because it's a whole circuit. It's constantly in motion. And if we can stop it at any point we can, that is, however small it may be, an opening for something else. So yeah, I just really appreciate that a lot, and the things that Extinction Rebellion is doing. Thanks for plugging you guys as well. And yeah, I guess if people have more questions, they could maybe get in touch with you via Slack or something or whatever.
Yeah, I'm Comrade Dave on Slack.
Nice. Thank you, Comrade Dave.
Okay.